Okay, well, this video is meant as kind of a reminder of some of the things we talked about regarding lesson plan development, taking standards and turning them into a lesson plan. So I'm just going to kind of recap some of the things we talked about in class: lesson plan resources, how questions truly matter in the lesson plan process, creating what I call the perfect circle in lesson plan development, and then reiterate the ropes. So you have many ideas for lesson plans: search engines, professional associations, business and industry, the different CTSO websites, which I strongly encourage you to go to if you are not familiar with them and also you're looking for an idea for a lesson. And then, of course, we have our curriculum standards, and at least for the sake of this course, that's going to be eventually where you start the process. So when we talk about increasing rigor, really, in order to begin the process of increasing rigor, we have to ask the question, what are you asking students to do? And when it comes down to it, you're probably asking them to do either to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, or create something. And this looks familiar to all of us because it's the Bloom's Taxonomy. And so if you remember in class, I talked about how I think if you were to examine most teachers' lessons that haven't thoroughly examined their own lessons to see where they align with Bloom's, you'll find that most of them fall within the lowest levels of learning: remembering, understanding, and applying. And so I just encourage you in general to always try to push your lessons up to the higher levels of learning. Try to find strategies that would allow that to occur. And so we talked about this, that we really want to be in the application, analyzation, evaluation, and creation levels of learning. And so you should have some resources. Plus, remember, you can always go to Google to look for ideas. And so then we started talking about the alignment circle, how we take our standards, we turn those into terminal objectives. We then utilize the terminal objective to help us develop the enabling objectives. And then that's when we have to start thinking about the overall assessment. And if you recall, the overall assessment, at least for the sake of this assignment, will be taking your enabling objectives and turning that into some type of overall lesson rubric. And then once we do all that, then it's time for us to seriously think about how we want to deliver this material. And when we do that, we've perfectly aligned our lesson plan and assessment with the standards that we've been asked to get students to master. Okay, and so then, although this is an older picture of the Michigan Center for Career and Technical Education, or what we now call the MCCTE Navigator, you will notice that this looks pretty familiar from what we showed, what we examined in class. So where I've gone is I've gone to the Educator General Standards. And just to give you kind of an example of how to do all this, I'm going to use that particular standard. So it's under technical skills, instructional strategies, and then the standard is use learning activities and assignments to challenge and engage learners. Now, we've already talked about how some of these standards have been written to exactly what you would want to do. Like it's the right level of learning. It's worded in a way in which you believe you could develop a lesson around it, and enabling objectives. This is not one of those. So when we look back at our alignment circle, we now have a standard, and we now have to start messing around with the terminal objective. And so when I look at the standard itself that I chose, use learning activities and assignments to challenge and engage learners, it's very vague. It's difficult to measure. Use is a tough one there. So I need to refine it. And when I start thinking about refining it, I have to look at Bloom's, right? And so when I look at Bloom's and I look at some of the verbs under Bloom's, I automatically go to the top here, and it's remembering, understanding, applying. But I want to see if I can take this somewhat vaguely written statement and push it down into a higher level of learning? Is there a way I could do that? And so I'm just going to kind of wing it here and go with, let me see if I can make maybe an analyzing, evaluating, or creating type of overall lesson out of this particular state standard. And so this is what I came up with. This should look familiar with you. This is a terminal objective as we practiced in class. You will notice that it has a condition, it has a performance, and it has a criterion. So the condition part of it would be the first part. Given various classroom scenarios, that's the condition. The student, and one thing I forgot to mention in class would be that it's always going to be the student, not the students. And that's basically just so that you remember that we are not a normative-based course or a normative-based discipline. We are very much task-oriented. And so each student is performing this individual task. It's not a group of students, it's individually based. So the student will create the most engaging format of instructional strategies for each scenario. So what I'm doing there is I'm trying to push this particular standard to a higher level of learning by talking about it as the student is going to create from scratch an engaging format of instructional strategies for each of the scenarios that I provide. And then the last part is utilizing my enabling objectives, I'm then going to create a rubric. And so what I'm saying here is that they have to show mastery to the level of 80% on that rubric. So that's my criterion. So if we look here, we go back to alignment circle. We've taken our standard. We've now developed the terminal objective. And if you recall, after we develop the terminal objective, we then have to develop the enabling objectives. Now, when we talk about the enabling objectives support the overall goal or the terminal objective. So they have to be measurable, and they're always going to be a little bit more specific than the overall. And it tells you and the student how they're going to master the terminal objective. So when I start thinking about my terminal objective, which is up top here, the student will create the most engaging format of instructional strategies for each scenario. The first thing that comes to mind is, well, they're going to have to summarize the 3 different types of instructional strategies that engage learners. And in order to do that, that's probably an understanding level of learning. They're going to have to list the advantages and disadvantages of each instructional strategy. To me, that would be probably analyzing level of learning. They're going to have to evaluate the appropriateness of each instructional strategies as they relate to various contexts. And to me, that's probably an evaluation level of learning. And then the very last thing they're going to have to do is create a series of lesson outlines that reflect the most engaging sequence of instructional strategies. Now, that's a pretty high level of learning. So I would say that that's the highest level of learning, which is creation. So there are my enabling objectives. I've come up with 4 of them for the sake of this example. Now, when you do your enabling objectives, you're going to do the same thing in regards to they're going to start with a verb. The verb is going to be a measurable, specific verb, and then you're also going to identify the level of learning for each one of your enabling objectives. So I'm going to expect to see that on your lesson plan. So here we are in the alignment circle. The next step would be your assessment. And then for the sake of this assignment, while you may, in the real world, draft up concepts and ideas for all of your assessments, maybe written assessments, maybe it's projects, maybe it's a checklist. For the sake of this assignment, this is where you'll then take those enabling objectives and you'll fold them into a rubric, and then you'll fill out a rubric, and that's the rubric that you're going to supply when you come in to do your lesson. So in general, assessments are driven by your enabling objectives, and they're how you intend to measure mastery. And there could be a multitude of assessments. For the sake of this assignment, I'm looking just for an overall kind of rubric where you've taken your enabling objectives and you thought about them enough that you could complete a rubric to show how a student would master each one of those enabling objectives. So let's say you've done that. Now it's time for us to focus on the lesson plan. So your first step is going to be to examine your enabling objectives. And remember, I told you that you may end up with more enabling objectives than you could possibly have a student master in 50 minutes. And that's the most time that I'm going to provide you in your lesson plan. Therefore, what you're going to have to do is look at your enabling objectives and start from the top and just highlight the ones that you think we are going to cover or have the student master in that 50 minutes. So when I look at this, that's my terminal objective at the top, and there's my enabling objectives. When I look at it, I think probably in a matter of 50 minutes, given that I would give them a little homework prior, probably we could do the first two enabling objectives. The other two we're going to have to work on maybe at another time. So now let's briefly cover ropes. We covered it very briefly in class. So now we're going to talk about it just a little bit more. The ROPES is an acronym that stands for Review, Overview, Presentation, Exercise, and Summary. The R in ROPES stands for Review, and there's two things that you primarily want to do in the first part of your lesson, and one is assess prior knowledge, and the second one would be to try to engage students. And so I called this an anticipatory set because that's what I learned when I was going through. But basically, it's an attention getter, right? And so for my example, what I did was I gave them homework prior to class. And the homework was to define the three types of instructional strategies that exist. And so this partly meets my first assessment that I had because I envisioned that I would have a checklist, right? And so the students would do this homework assignment of defining these so that we didn't waste class time doing that. And then they would bring it in, and I would quickly review it to make sure that they had the right definitions, and that would be a check on an assessment checklist. You could also imagine that on your rubric, maybe this would be a part of how they earn full points for that particular enabling objective. And then I also had an entry slip with questions. So when the students would first walk in, there would be a slip of paper on their desk, or maybe something I handed them because I was at the door greeting them. And it would just have maybe a scenario, a very quick scenario, and they would have to define which of the three instructional strategies does this scenario meet. And then for an attention getter, I would have that video that we all love of Ferris Bueller, the video in Ferris Bueller of that economics teacher talking about voodoo economics, right? And we would then discuss that video and talk about engagement. So you recall that video.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effect...
Right. So we remember the video. And then for the overview section, that was a very simple one. Remember, it was just where you share the objectives for the lesson. So today what we're going to learn is this, that, and the other, right? Now the presentation section, what I'm doing at this point is I'm dissecting the two, the presentation and exercise. But if you recall, in class we talked about how potentially your presentation and exercise may blend. And if that's the case, then just that's the way in which you should mention it in the lesson plan. So you wouldn't have a presentation and exercise separate sections. You may combine those, right? But for the sake of just explanation, I'm parsing them out. So when it comes to the presentation section, new knowledge is being shared or discovered. presentation, maybe it's a discussion, maybe it's think, pair, share, maybe it's some type of discovery learning, maybe it's guided practice or demonstration, right? So for my example, I'm going to have a classroom discussion on different instructional strategies. I'll then share the strategies within each category, share an example of an instructional strategy plan, right? So I'm priming them and getting them ready for an exercise. And so then we launch into the exercise section of ropes. The exercise section of ropes would be independent or facilitated work, potentially. And it's basically where we practice mastering the concept. So for my particular example, what I would have them do is I'd pair them with another student. And this is something we didn't talk about. We talked about grouping. And for the most part, when we group, we want to group in odd numbers. But if you're just doing an exercise in class that's just supposed to last 15, 20 minutes, there's nothing wrong with pairing people up. I don't want you to get the mindset that it always has to be 3 to 5. If you're doing a project that's going to be, maybe it's the entire block, it's 3 or 4 hours, or maybe it's an entire week, or it's a few days, then I would suggest implementing some of the ideas that we talked about with grouping students. But for this particular exercise, pairing them up is perfectly reasonable and fine to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them identify the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy, as well as the best use of each strategy. So then we get to the summary section. And the summary section basically is supposed to be a time in which you have them prove that they mastered the material or the concept that you just shared with them. And there are a million ways to do this. An exit slip, post-test, games, think, pair, share, throw the ball, as I mentioned, and have people answer various questions. I mean, the sky's the limit with how you check for mastery. So for my example, since I've put them into groups and had them analyze some case studies and then write some best scenarios or the best use of instructional strategies, I'm then going to have the group share their findings. I'm going to collect their work so I can look at it later. I'm going to pass out a matching worksheet and have students identify appropriate instructional strategies, so it's an additional piece of work that's separate from what they just worked on. And then I'll look at that to see, did they really learn anything? And so with the combination of having them share their findings, looking at their work later, passing out another small matching worksheet, having them identify the appropriate strategies, and then look to see if they've learned there, then I think I would get a pretty good grasp of if they have mastered those 2 enabling objectives. Mind you, we have not gotten to the last 2 higher levels of learning lesson plans. So let's say in our hypothetical situation, I've reviewed their work and I find that the majority of students, maybe all of them, have mastered the first enabling objective and the second enabling objective. So now what I would do is if I haven't already, I'd start thinking about developing the lesson plans for the evaluation and creation enabling objectives that I have. So just to recap, we've taken standards, we've turned them into terminal objective. We then looked at the terminal objective and developed enabling objectives. We then tied those enabling objectives to some type of an assessment rubric. We've then utilized that assessment rubric and enabling objectives to help us form the lesson plan. And now we can defend that our lesson plan is perfectly aligned with standards. All right, well, hopefully this helped, and I look forward to seeing your lesson plan ideas soon.